I was 68 years old when the letter arrived. 30 years. 30 goddamn years of silence, and then there it was, my son's handwriting on expensive cream-colored paper, the kind that probably cost more than I used to make in a week. The return address was from some fancy neighborhood I'd never heard of, and my hands were shaking as I tore it open. Dad, I hope this finds you well. It's been too long. I'd like to invite you to spend Christmas with me and my family. We have so much to catch up on. That's it. No explanation. No apology. Just an invitation that arrived 3 days after Forbes magazine published an article about my company hitting the billion-dollar mark. If you've ever been abandoned by the person you love most in this world, then you know the feeling that crashed over me in that moment. It wasn't relief. It wasn't joy. It was rage. Pure, white-hot rage that I hadn't felt since the day he walked out of my life. But before I tell you what I did with that invitation, before I tell you about the Christmas that would finally give me the revenge I'd been dreaming about for 3 decades, I need to take you back. Way back to when everything fell apart. Because this story about betrayal and blood and what it really means to be family, it starts with a lie. A lie that cost me everything I ever cared about. And if you're the kind of person who believes that family should stick together no matter what, well, you might want to hit that subscribe button right now. Because what you're about to hear is going to change how you think about forgiveness forever. My name is Frank Castellano, and I'm about to tell you how I lost my son, built an empire, and served up the coldest dish of revenge you've ever heard. But I'm warning you, this isn't one of those feel-good stories where everyone hugs it out at the end. This is real life. And in real life, sometimes the people who hurt you the most are the ones who share your blood. It was 1993 when everything went to hell. I was 38 years old, working 16-hour days trying to keep my small construction business afloat. Danny was 8, the brightest, most curious kid you'd ever meet. He'd sit in my workshop for hours, asking me about every tool, every piece of wood, every nail. Dad, why does this saw cut crooked? Dad, can you teach me to hammer like you? That kid was my whole world. My wife Carol had been gone for 2 years by then. Cancer took her fast and mean, leaving me to raise Danny alone. I was drowning, working myself to death trying to provide for him while dealing with my own grief. Some nights I'd come home so exhausted I could barely heat up a can of soup for dinner. But Danny never complained. Not once. That's what made what happened next so much worse. My brother Vincent lived about 20 minutes away with his wife Sharon and their 2 kids. Vincent was everything I wasn't: smooth, successful, drove a BMW, lived in a house with a 3-car garage. He owned a chain of sporting goods stores and never let me forget it. Every family gathering, every phone call, it was the same thing. Frank, you're killing yourself with this construction thing. Why don't you come work for me? I could use someone with your work ethic. I always said no. I was stubborn. Proud. I wanted to build something of my own, something I could pass down to Danny. But pride doesn't pay the bills, and by November of '93, I was 3 months behind on everything: mortgage, truck payments, equipment loans. The bank was making noises about foreclosure. That's when Vincent made his offer. Not a job, something bigger. He wanted to buy into my business, become a partner. 50-50 split, he said. He'd pay off all my debts, give me the capital to bid on bigger jobs, help me grow. All I had to do was sign some papers. I should have read those papers more carefully. But I was desperate, and Vincent was family. Family doesn't screw family, right? That's what I believed. That's what I told myself as I signed my name on document after document in his lawyer's office, Danny fidgeting in the chair next to me, swinging his little legs and asking when we could get ice cream. Within 6 months, Vincent owned my company. Not 50%, all of it. Turns out those papers I signed weren't a partnership agreement. They were a buyout contract, structured as a loan with my business as collateral. When I couldn't make the astronomical payments Vincent's lawyer had buried in the fine print, the business became his. Just like that. But losing the business wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what Vincent told Danny. Your dad's a failure, kid. I heard him say one afternoon when I went to pick up Danny from their house. Vincent didn't know I was standing in the hallway, listening. He lost everything because he's weak. Lazy. Your mom would be ashamed of him. Danny was 9 years old. 9 years old, and his uncle was poisoning him against me. But he works all the time, Danny said, his voice small and confused. Working hard and working smart are two different things, Vincent replied. Your dad never learned the difference. That's why he's a loser. That's why we have to take care of you now. That's when I understood what was happening. This wasn't just about the business. This was about Danny. Vincent and Sharon had been trying to have another kid for years with no luck. They saw my son, my brilliant, wonderful boy, and they wanted him. They were systematically turning him against me, making him believe I was worthless, unreliable, unfit. And it was working. Danny started spending more time at their house. Started canceling our weekend plans. Started looking at me with something I'd never seen in his eyes before, disappointment. When I'd pick him up from school, he'd barely talk to me. When I tried to help him with homework, he'd say Uncle Vincent was already helping him. When I'd suggest we build something together in the garage, he'd make excuses. The final blow came the day after Danny's 10th birthday. I'd saved for months to buy him a real tool set, nothing fancy, but quality stuff he could learn with. When I gave it to him, he looked at the box like it was contaminated. Uncle Vincent says tools are for people who can't afford to pay others to do things for them, Danny said. He says I'm going to college, not trade school. That night, I sat in my empty garage, surrounded by the tools that used to be my livelihood, and I made a decision. I was going to fight back. I was going to prove to my son that his father wasn't the failure Vincent made me out to be. I was going to build something so big, so successful, that everyone would know Vincent was wrong about me. I just never imagined it would take 30 years. And I never imagined that when success finally came, it would taste so bitter. The night everything changed forever was December 23, 1994. Danny was 11, and I'd been fighting for him for over a year. Not in court. I couldn't afford lawyers like Vincent could, but in small ways. Showing up to every school event, every game, every parent-teacher conference. Trying to prove I was still his father, still worthy of his love. That Christmas Eve, I had planned something special. I'd managed to scrape together enough money to take Danny to the city to see the Christmas display at Macy's, just like his mother and I used to do when he was little. Carol had loved those trips. She'd make hot chocolate in a thermos and we'd ride the subway, Danny pressed against the window, watching the world blur by. I picked him up from Vincent's house around noon. Danny was quiet on the drive, staring out the passenger window with that distant look he'd been wearing more and more lately. But I was determined to break through. This was going to be our day. Remember when Mom used to take us to see the windows? I asked as we drove into Manhattan. You'd make her tell you the story behind every single display. Danny shrugged. I was just a kid then. You're still a kid, I said, forcing a laugh. 11 isn't exactly ancient. But he didn't laugh back. He just kept staring out that window like he was looking for an escape route. The windows were beautiful that year, elaborate scenes with moving parts, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. A winter wonderland with real snow falling inside the glass. I watched Danny's reflection more than the displays themselves, searching for any sign of the wonder I used to see in his face. There were moments, brief flashes, when something would catch his eye and he'd lean forward slightly, almost forgetting to be indifferent. But then he'd catch himself and step back, like caring about something I had brought him to see was a betrayal of Vincent's teachings. After the windows, we went to a little Italian restaurant Carol and I used to love. It was cramped and loud and the checkered tablecloths were stained, but they made the best meatballs in the city. Danny ordered chicken fingers, safe, boring chicken fingers instead of trying anything new. This place is kind of gross, he said, looking around at the worn vinyl booths and the ancient photographs of Sicily covering the walls. Your mother proposed to me in this restaurant, I told him. It wasn't true, I'd proposed to her, but I wanted to make him smile, to shock him a little. Mom proposed to you? For the first time all day, he looked directly at me. "Right at this table," I said. "Got down on one knee and everything. I was so surprised I knocked over my wine, and it went all over her dress." Danny's mouth twitched like he was fighting a smile. "You're lying. Ask Uncle Vincent," I said. "He was there." That was my mistake. Mentioning Vincent. The moment I said his name, Danny's face closed off again. "Uncle Vincent says you lie about Mom all the time," Danny said. "He says you make up stories to make yourself look better." The words hit me like a physical blow. "What else does Uncle Vincent say about me?" Danny looked down at his chicken fingers, and for a moment I thought he wasn't going to answer. When he did speak, his voice was so quiet I had to lean forward to hear him. "He says Mom only married you because she felt sorry for you. He says she told Aunt Sharon she regretted it. He says if she hadn't gotten sick, she would have left you anyway." I sat there in that noisy restaurant, surrounded by families laughing and celebrating, and felt something inside me break. Not just crack, completely shatter. Vincent hadn't just stolen my business and poisoned my relationship with my son. He'd stolen my memories of Carol too. He'd taken the one pure thing I had left and twisted it into something ugly. "Danny," I said, reaching across the table toward his hand. "That's not true. None of that is true. Your mother loved me, and I loved her, and both of us loved you more than anything in this world." But Danny pulled his hand away. "Then why did you let her die?" The question came out of nowhere, hitting me like a sledgehammer to the chest. "What?" "You heard me." Now Danny was looking at me again, but there was something new in his eyes. Something that looked like hatred. "Uncle Vincent says if you'd gotten her better doctors, if you hadn't been so cheap, she might still be alive. He says you killed her." I couldn't breathe. The restaurant kept spinning around me, voices and laughter blending into white noise. Vincent hadn't just poisoned Danny against me, he'd convinced my son that I was responsible for his mother's death. "Danny, that's not. Your mother had the best doctors. We tried everything. The cancer was too aggressive, it had spread too far before we caught it. There was nothing anyone could have done." But I could see in his face that he didn't believe me. Vincent's poison had taken root too deep. "I want to go back to Uncle Vincent's house," Danny said. Now. The drive back to Vincent's was the longest hour of my life. Danny didn't speak, didn't look at me, didn't respond when I tried to explain about his mother, about how much we both loved him, about how proud she would have been of the young man he was becoming. He just sat there like a stone, counting down the minutes until he could get away from me. When we pulled into Vincent's driveway, Danny was out of the car before I'd even put it in park. But instead of running straight to the house, he stopped and turned back to me. For just a second, I thought maybe he was going to say something, maybe apologize for what he'd said about his mother. Instead, he said the words that would echo in my head for the next 30 years. "I wish Uncle Vincent was my real dad." Then he was gone, running up the front steps and disappearing into the house without looking back. I sat in that driveway for 20 minutes, engine running, heat blasting, trying to figure out what to do next. Through the living room window, I could see Danny on the couch between Vincent and Sharon, opening presents. Expensive presents. A new bike that probably cost more than my rent. Video games I could never afford. Clothes from stores I'd never even been inside. Vincent saw me sitting there. He came to the window and looked out at me with this smug smile, like he was a king surveying his conquered territory. Then he put his hand on Danny's shoulder, a gesture of ownership that made my blood boil, and slowly drew the curtains closed. That's when I knew I'd lost. Not just the battle, but the war. Vincent had everything: money, influence, the ability to give Danny all the things I couldn't. And he had something else too: time. Every day Danny spent in that house was another day of programming, another day of poison, another day further away from me. But as I drove home to my empty apartment, something crystallized in my mind. A plan. A purpose. Vincent thought he'd won because he had money? Fine. I'd get money. More money than he'd ever dreamed of. I'd build an empire that would make his little sporting goods stores look like lemonade stands. And when I did, when I was rich enough to buy and sell him 10 times over, I'd come back for my son. It would take 30 years. But I'd wait. Because revenge, real revenge, isn't about getting mad. It's about getting even. And I was going to get so even that Vincent would regret the day he decided to steal everything I loved. I just didn't know then that by the time I was rich enough to fight back, there wouldn't be anything left worth fighting for. The first 5 years after losing Danny were the hardest of my life. I was starting from less than zero, no business, no savings, and a credit rating that made loan sharks look appealing. But I had something. Vincent didn't understand. The kind of rage that burns cold and steady, the kind that doesn't consume you but transforms you. I moved to Phoenix in 1995. Far enough from New York to start fresh, close enough to Mexican labor that knew construction inside and out. I found a one-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood where the police sirens were part of the nighttime lullaby, and I got to work. My first job was framing houses for a contractor who paid in cash and didn't ask too many questions about work papers. I made $8 an hour and saved 6 of it. Lived on ramen noodles and peanut butter sandwiches. Slept on a mattress on the floor because furniture was a luxury I couldn't afford. Every night, I'd lie there staring at the ceiling, thinking about Danny, wondering what he was doing, whether he ever thought about me. But here's the thing about rock bottom. It gives you a solid foundation to build on. Within a year, I'd saved enough to buy my own tools and start taking side jobs. Small stuff at first, fixing leaky roofs, replacing rotted deck boards, the kind of work nobody else wanted. But I did it fast, I did it right, and word started getting around. By 1997, I had 3 guys working for me. By 1999, I'd incorporated as Castellano Construction, and we were doing complete home renovations. Nothing fancy, but steady work that paid the bills and let me start building some capital. The breakthrough came in 2001, right after September 11th. The whole country was shaken, construction was slow, and a lot of contractors were going under. But I saw an opportunity. All those office buildings and hotels that suddenly needed better security, reinforced structures, upgraded fire systems, someone had to do that work. I spent every dime I had getting certified for commercial security installations. Learned about blast-resistant materials, bulletproof glass, reinforced concrete. While other contractors were cutting crews and closing shop, I was bidding on government contracts and corporate security upgrades. The first big job was retrofitting a federal courthouse in Tucson. $3 million contract, more money than I'd seen in my entire life. I hired 20 guys, rented equipment I couldn't afford, and worked 18-hour days for 8 months straight. But we delivered on time and under budget. That's when everything changed. Word got around that Castellano Construction could handle the specialized work that other companies couldn't or wouldn't do. Airport renovations. Embassy security upgrades. Government buildings that needed to meet new Post 9/11 standards. The contracts got bigger and bigger. But success is a funny thing. The more I achieved, the more hollow it felt. Every milestone I reached, every check that cleared, every expansion of the business, it all just reminded me of what I was really doing this for. And every year that passed without a word from Danny made the victory feel more like defeat. I hired private investigators twice to find out how he was doing. The first one, in 2003, told me Danny was 17, a senior in high school, and planning to attend NYU in the fall. Vincent was paying for everything: tuition, room and board, spending money. Danny had legally changed his last name from Castellano to Vincent's surname, Morrison. That news hit me like a truck. My son didn't just hate me, he'd erased me. Wiped away every trace of his connection to me, including the name I'd given him. The second investigator's report came in 2008. Danny, now Daniel Morrison, had graduated from NYU with a business degree and was working at one of Vincent's stores. He'd gotten married the year before to a girl named Jennifer. Vincent had walked him down the aisle. I stared at that wedding photo for hours. My son looked happy, successful, completely at peace. Like he'd never had another father, like I'd never existed. Vincent was beaming in his tuxedo, playing the role of proud father to perfection. That's when I realized something that almost broke me. I wasn't building this empire to win Danny back anymore. I was building it to prove a point to a son who would never care. But I kept going anyway. Because what else was there to do? By 2010, Castellano Construction had become Castellano Security Solutions, and we were operating in 12 states. We didn't just retrofit buildings anymore. We designed and built secure facilities from the ground up. Private corporate bunkers for Fortune 500 CEOs. Safe rooms for celebrities and politicians. Military-grade residential compounds for people who had more money than sense. The profit margins were insane. A job that cost me $2 million to complete would bill for $8 million. My clients didn't care about the price. They cared about results. And I delivered results. I moved to a penthouse apartment in Scottsdale. Bought a Porsche, then a Ferrari, then decided cars were boring and started collecting vintage motorcycles instead. Traveled to Dubai and Singapore and London, always first class, always the best hotels. Had dinner with senators and movie stars and oil barons who hired me to keep their families safe. But every night, alone in that penthouse, I'd think about Danny. Wonder if he had kids of his own now. Wonder if Vincent was teaching them to hate me too, passing down the poison to another generation. The third investigator's report came in 2015. Danny and Jennifer had 2 children, a boy named Thomas, 7 years old, and a girl named Emma, 4. They lived in a house that Vincent had bought for them in an exclusive suburb outside Albany. Danny was now managing 3 of Vincent's stores and seemed to be his heir apparent to the business. Vincent was 68 by then, the same age I am now as I'm telling you this story. His health was declining, diabetes, heart problems, the kind of issues that come with a lifetime of rich food and easy living. But he was still the king of his little empire, still playing grandfather to my grandchildren, still the father figure in Danny's life. Looking at those photos of my grandchildren, seeing Thomas's face, my father's face, generations of Castellano features that no amount of name-changing could erase, I felt something crack inside my chest. Not break. Crack. Like ice beginning to split under pressure. That's when I made the decision that would define the next 10 years of my life. I was going to get so rich, so powerful, so undeniably successful that everyone would have to acknowledge what Vincent had tried to bury. That Frank Castellano was not a failure. That Frank Castellano was not weak. That Frank Castellano had built something that dwarfed everything Vincent had ever achieved. By 2018, my company was worth over $500 million. We were the go-to security firm for 3 Fortune 500 companies, the State Department, and half the billionaires in Silicon Valley. I had offices in 8 countries and more than 2,000 employees. But it still wasn't enough. Because Vincent was still alive, still playing father to my son, still enjoying the fruits of what he'd stolen from me 30 years earlier. Then, in December of 2023, 2 things happened that changed everything. First, Vincent Morrison died of a massive heart attack while playing golf at his country club. He was 76 years old, surrounded by wealth and family, and the respect of his community. He died believing he'd won. Second, Forbes magazine published their annual list of America's newest billionaires. And there, at number 847, was a name Vincent never lived to see: Frank Castellano, CEO and founder of Castellano Security Solutions, net worth $1.2 billion. 3 days later, the letter arrived. My son, reaching out after 30 years of silence. Not because he missed me. Not because he regretted the lost time. But because his meal ticket was dead and his real father was rich. If you think that's when this story gets happy, you haven't been paying attention. Because sometimes, winning doesn't feel like victory at all. Sometimes it just feels like you've finally gathered enough ammunition to destroy everything you once loved. Chapter 3 Word count, approximately 1,400 words. Hashtag Chapter 4, The Invitation and the Plan. I read Danny's letter exactly 17 times before I set it down on my kitchen counter. Each reading revealed another layer of careful calculation, another hint at the real motivation behind those polite, distant words. We have so much to catch up on. What did we have to catch up on? 30 years of silence? 3 decades of pretending I didn't exist? The fact that he'd legally erased my name from his identity and let another man walk him down the aisle at his wedding? Or maybe he wanted to catch up on my Forbes ranking. Maybe he wanted to discuss my net worth, my portfolio, my suddenly very interesting bank account. The letter was dated December 15, 2024. Vincent had died on December 3rd, 12 days. It took my son 12 days after his surrogate father's funeral to remember he had a biological parent walking around somewhere. I poured myself 3 fingers of Macallan 25, the kind of scotch I used to dream about when I was eating ramen noodles in Phoenix, and sat down to think. Really think. About what Danny wanted, what I wanted, and what justice looked like after 30 years of waiting. The smart play would have been to ignore the letter. File it away with all the other disappointments life had served me and keep living my comfortable, successful, empty life. I had everything a man was supposed to want: money, power, respect, freedom. What did I need with a son who'd only remembered I existed when Uncle Vincent's credit card stopped working? But here's the thing about revenge: it's not rational. It's not about making smart plays or taking the high road. It's about settling accounts. And I had a very old account that was past due for payment. Over the next week, I did some research. Not through private investigators this time. I had resources now that made that unnecessary. Phone calls to the right people, favors owed and collected, information that money could buy but couldn't be purchased legally. What I learned was fascinating. Vincent's sporting goods empire had been struggling for years. Competition from online retailers, changing consumer habits, the usual story of small retail getting crushed by market forces. The stores were leveraged to the hilt, mortgaged against properties that had declined in value, bleeding money faster than they could generate it. Vincent had been propping up the business with personal loans and credit lines, using his reputation and relationships to keep the lights on. But reputation doesn't pay suppliers, and relationships don't cover payroll. When he died, he left behind a business that looked successful from the outside but was actually a house of cards waiting for the wrong breeze. Danny had inherited not a thriving empire, but a beautiful disaster. The flagship store where he worked as general manager, really more of an overpaid clerk with a fancy title, was 3 months behind on rent. The house Vincent had bought for Danny and Jennifer was mortgaged to pay business debts. Even the college funds Vincent had set up for my grandchildren had been raided to cover operating expenses. My son was broke. Worse than broke, he was drowning in debt he didn't even know existed until the lawyers read Vincent's will and explained what he'd actually inherited. That's when Danny's letter made perfect sense. He wasn't reaching out because he missed his father. He was reaching out because he needed his father's money. The irony was so perfect it almost made me laugh. Vincent had spent 30 years convincing Danny that I was a loser, a failure, someone to be ashamed of. And now Danny was going to have to come crawling to that same loser, hat in hand, looking for a bailout. But I wasn't going to make it easy for him. Why should I? He'd had 30 years to reach out, 30 years to pick up a phone or write a letter or make any kind of gesture that suggested he remembered he had a father. He'd chosen silence. Now he'd have to live with the consequences of that choice. I called my assistant and had her book a flight to Albany for December 22nd. Then I called my lawyer and had him draw up some very specific documents. If Danny wanted to play the long-lost son card, I was happy to play along. But we were going to play by my rules. The house looked exactly like what it was, a wealthy man's idea of what successful people should live in. Colonial style, probably built in the 1980s when that was fashionable, with a circular driveway and carefully manicured landscaping that screamed, "We pay people to make this look effortless." It was also clearly expensive to maintain, which explained a lot about Danny's financial situation. The property taxes alone probably cost more per year than most people's salaries. Vincent had set his replacement son up in a lifestyle that required constant money to sustain, then died and left him holding the bag. I parked my rental car, a modest sedan, nothing flashy, and sat for a moment looking at the house. This was it. 30 years of preparation, 30 years of building and planning and dreaming about this moment, and here I was. Through the living room window, I could see Christmas lights and what looked like a massive tree. Stockings hung from a mantelpiece that probably cost more than my first apartment's annual rent. Everything looked perfect, festive, successful. A Norman Rockwell painting of American family Christmas. Except the family inside owed more money than they could pay, and the grandfather who'd made their lifestyle possible was 6 feet underground. I straightened my tie, Hermes, because sometimes the details matter, and walked up to the front door. Before I could knock, it swung open, and there was my son. Danny was 41 now, but he still had the face I remembered from when he was 8 years old, sitting in my workshop and asking questions about everything. The same dark eyes, the same stubborn chin, the same expression of intense concentration when he was trying to figure something out. But there were lines around those eyes now, and gray threading through his hair, and something in his posture that spoke of strain. He looked like a man carrying weight he wasn't sure he could bear. "Dad," he said, and the words sounded strange coming from his mouth after so many years of silence. "You came. You invited me," I replied. Though I have to admit, I was surprised to hear from you. For just a moment, something flickered across his face, guilt, maybe, or shame. But then it was gone, replaced by the careful smile of someone who'd learned to hide his real feelings. "Come in," he said. "Everyone's excited to meet you." Everyone. My grandchildren, who'd been taught that their grandfather was a man named Vincent Morrison. Jennifer, who'd probably heard stories about Danny's biological father that painted me as everything from a deadbeat to a criminal. Maybe even some of Vincent's other relatives, the extended family that had helped steal my son and then pretended I'd never existed. This was going to be interesting. As I stepped across the threshold into my son's house for the first time in 3 decades, I felt something shift inside my chest. Not love, that had been beaten to death years ago. Not hope, I'd given up on that around the time Danny changed his name. What I felt was something colder, more focused, more purposeful. I felt ready. Ready to collect on 30 years of compound interest. Ready to show Danny exactly what his choices had cost him. Ready to demonstrate the difference between the father who'd failed him and the father who'd succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. But most of all, I felt ready to answer the question that had haunted me for 3 decades. What happens when the son who abandoned you needs you more than you ever needed him? We were about to find out. The inside of Danny's house was a museum of the life I'd been excluded from. Family photos covered every surface. Danny's high school graduation with Vincent beaming beside him, the wedding where another man walked my son down the aisle, birthday parties and vacations and holidays spanning decades. 30 years of memories that didn't include me, displayed like trophies of my absence. But it was the children's artwork that hit me hardest. Crayon drawings stuck to the refrigerator with magnets, construction paper cards from school projects, all signed with careful childish handwriting. "Happy Father's Day, Daddy." "I love you, Dad." Words I'd never received from Danny, now being given to him by the grandchildren I'd never met. "Jennifer, kids, come meet your grandfather," Danny called out, his voice carrying that forced cheerfulness people use when they're trying to make awkward situations seem normal. A woman appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Jennifer was prettier than her photos, but there was tension in her shoulders and worry lines around her eyes that hadn't been there in the pictures from 5 years ago. She extended her hand with the polite smile of someone who'd been coached on how to handle this meeting. "Mr. Castellano," she said. "It's so nice to finally meet you. Danny's told me so much about you." That was a lie, and we both knew it. Danny hadn't told her much of anything about me, because Danny didn't know much of anything about me. What he knew was a collection of 30-year-old facts and Vincent's poison, none of which would paint a picture of the man standing in her living room wearing a $2,000 suit. "Please call me Frank," I said, taking her hand. "And thank you for welcoming me into your home. It's beautiful." "Thank you." "Vincent, Danny's uncle, he helped us with the down payment when we bought it." She said it casually, but I caught the past tense. Vincent helped them. Vincent couldn't help them anymore. Vincent was dead and they were alone with bills they couldn't pay and a lifestyle they couldn't maintain. That's when the children appeared. Thomas was 13 now, tall for his age and carrying himself with the careful confidence of a kid who'd been raised with advantages. He had my nose and Danny's stubborn chin, and when he looked at me there was curiosity in his eyes but also wariness. Like he'd been warned about me but wasn't sure what he was supposed to be wary of. Emma was 10, all arms and legs and wild curly hair that reminded me painfully of Carol when she was young. She hung back behind her brother, staring at me with the unblinking intensity that only children can manage. "Thomas, Emma, this is your grandfather," Jennifer said. "Your daddy's father." "But what about Grandpa Vince?" Emma asked, her voice small and confused. "Is he our grandfather too?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a gun. Danny's face went red, Jennifer looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor, and I felt that familiar rage start to build in my chest. Even dead, Vincent was still claiming territory that should have been mine. "Grandpa Vince was your great-uncle," Danny said carefully. "He was my uncle, which made him your great-uncle. This is my father, which makes him your grandfather. But you never talked about him before," Thomas said, and there was something in his voice that sounded uncomfortably like accusation. "Where was he when we were little?" Out of the mouths of babes. Where was I when they were little? I was building an empire, making billions, conquering markets and accumulating power. I was becoming everything Vincent said I couldn't be. But I wasn't here, in this living room, watching my grandchildren grow up. "Sometimes adults make mistakes," Danny said, glancing at me with an expression I couldn't read. "Sometimes families get separated and it takes time to find each other again." Another lie. We hadn't been separated by accident or misunderstanding. Danny had chosen Vincent over me, chosen money and comfort over loyalty and blood. But I wasn't going to correct him in front of his children. Not yet. "That's right," I said, kneeling down to Emma's eye level. "Sometimes life gets complicated. But I'm here now, and I'd like to get to know you both." Emma studied my face with that intense way children have of looking at adults, like she was trying to solve a puzzle. "Do you have presents for us?" "Emma!" Jennifer scolded, but I held up a hand. "It's okay. It's a fair question." I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out 2 small boxes. "I wasn't sure what you'd like, so I brought something simple." The boxes contained vintage watches, a 1960s Omega for Thomas, a delicate Cartier for Emma. Nothing too flashy, but quality pieces that would last a lifetime. The kind of gifts that said, "I have excellent taste and unlimited resources," without being vulgar about it. Thomas opened his first, and his eyes widened when he saw the watch. "This is really old," he said. "Vintage," I corrected. "That watch belonged to a man who helped build the Golden Gate Bridge. It's been keeping perfect time for 60 years. It's worth more than your car," Emma announced after examining her watch. I laughed despite myself. "How would you know that?" "Because Grandpa Vince taught us about expensive things. He said you can tell how successful someone is by what they wear." She held up the watch to catch the light. "This is really expensive, isn't it?" "Emma, don't be rude," Danny said, but there was something in his voice that told me he was thinking the same thing. He was calculating, trying to figure out exactly how expensive those watches were, trying to understand what kind of money his father had now. "It's not rude, it's observant," I said. "Yes, Emma, it's expensive. But more importantly, it's special. Both of your watches are one-of-a-kind pieces with history behind them. Like you," Thomas said suddenly. "You're one-of-a-kind too. We never met anyone else's grandfather who disappeared for their whole life and then showed up at Christmas." The words hit like a slap. This kid didn't know he was voicing what everyone in the room was thinking, but he was smart enough to recognize that this situation wasn't normal. That grandfathers don't usually vanish for decades and then reappear bearing expensive gifts. "Thomas," Danny warned, but I could see he was curious about how I'd respond. "You're right," I told Thomas. "This isn't normal. Most grandfathers are around from the beginning. Most grandfathers don't miss 13 years of birthdays and Christmas mornings. But sometimes life doesn't work out the way people plan it. Why didn't it work out? Emma asked. How do you explain to a 10-year-old that her father chose money over family? That the man she'd called grandfather was a manipulative snake who stole everything that mattered to you? That sometimes the people who are supposed to love you the most are the ones who hurt you the deepest? That's a long story, I said. Maybe we can talk about it when you're older. I'm old enough now, Thomas said, and there was challenge in his voice. I'm 13. I know about divorce and death and family problems. I looked at Danny, who was studying his hands like they contained the secrets of the universe. He didn't want to have this conversation, didn't want to explain to his children why he'd cut his father out of his life for 3 decades. Didn't want to admit that maybe, just maybe, he made some choices he wasn't proud of. Your father and I had a disagreement a long time ago, I said carefully. We both said and did things we shouldn't have. Sometimes adults are just as bad at handling their feelings as kids are. What kind of disagreement? Emma pressed. The kind that takes 30 years to get over, I said, looking directly at Danny as I spoke. Dinner was a careful dance of polite conversation and loaded silences. Jennifer had clearly put enormous effort into the meal. Prime rib, lobster tails, sides that probably took her all day to prepare. The kind of feast that was meant to impress, to show that this family still had standards, still knew how to live well. But I could see the cracks beneath the surface. The wine was good but not great, the kind you buy when you want to look sophisticated but can't afford to actually be sophisticated. The china was beautiful but chipped in places, probably wedding gifts that had seen better days. The whole production had the feel of people trying very hard to maintain an image they could no longer afford. So, Dad, Danny said as we worked through the main course, Jennifer tells me you've done well for yourself. Construction, right? Security, I corrected. I design and build secure facilities for people who need protection. Like bodyguards? More like bulletproof buildings. Safe rooms, reinforced structures, the kind of places you go when regular security isn't enough. Thomas perked up. Like for celebrities? Sometimes. Politicians, business executives, people who have made enemies or just want to be prepared for the worst. Have you met anyone famous? Emma asked. I rattled off a few names, actors and politicians and tech billionaires whose homes and offices I'd secured. The children's eyes grew wider with each name, and I could see Danny doing the math, calculating what kind of money you'd need to have celebrities as clients. That must be lucrative work, Danny said carefully. It pays well, I agreed. But it's not really about the money anymore. It's about building something that lasts, something I can be proud of. Grandpa Vince always said money was how you kept score, Thomas said. He said if you weren't making money, you weren't winning. Vincent's philosophy, still echoing through another generation. I wondered what else Vincent had taught these children about success, about family, about what mattered in life. Your great-uncle was a businessman, I said. Businessmen tend to think in terms of profit and loss. But there are other ways to keep score. Like what? Emma asked. Like whether you can sleep at night knowing you've done right by the people who depend on you. Like whether you've built something that makes the world a little bit safer, a little bit better. Like whether you've been the kind of person your family can be proud of. I saw Danny flinch at that last part, and I felt a small, mean satisfaction. Let him think about it. Let him wonder whether his children would be proud of a father who'd abandoned his own father for money, then came crawling back when the money ran out. After dinner, Jennifer took the children upstairs to get ready for bed, leaving Danny and me alone in the living room with a bottle of cognac and 30 years of unfinished business between us. You look good, Dad, Danny said, settling into his chair with a glass that shook slightly in his hand. Successful. Happy. I've done well, I said. Better than anyone expected, I think. Better than Uncle Vincent expected? There it was. The acknowledgement that this had always been about Vincent, about proving him wrong, about showing that Frank Castellano wasn't the failure he'd been painted as. Much better, I said. But Vincent's dead now, so I suppose his opinion doesn't matter anymore. Danny was quiet for a long moment, staring into his cognac like it might contain answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. I know why you're here, he said finally. Do you? Jennifer thinks you want to reconnect with your grandchildren, maybe make up for lost time. But I know better. You're here because you've heard about Vincent's death and you want to gloat. You want to see what happened to the man who stole your son. He was partially right, but not completely. Yes, I wanted to see what Vincent's death had cost him. Yes, I wanted to understand the full scope of the mess Danny had inherited. But there was more to it than that. What I want, I said, is to understand why my son spent 30 years pretending I was dead, then suddenly remembered my existence the moment his meal ticket expired. Danny's face went white. That's not. I didn't. Forbes published their billionaire list 3 days before you sent that letter. I continued. Vincent died 12 days before that. You do the math. You think I only contacted you because you're rich? Danny's voice was rising, and I could hear his children's footsteps upstairs, getting ready for bed in the house their great-uncle had bought them, surrounded by the lifestyle they couldn't afford to maintain. I think you contacted me because you're broke, I said calmly. I think Vincent left you with more debt than assets, more problems than solutions. I think you're drowning, and you're hoping your rich father will throw you a life preserver. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, counting off the seconds until Danny would have to choose between his pride and his family's future. You're right, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. We're in trouble. Bad trouble. The business is failing, the house is mortgaged to pay debts, the kids' college funds are gone. I don't know what to do. And there it was. The admission I'd been waiting 30 years to hear. My son, the boy who'd wish Vincent was his real father, asking his actual father for help. How much do you need? I asked. Danny looked up at me with something that might have been hope. Maybe $2 million? Enough to pay off the business debts and keep the house. $2 million. A rounding error in my portfolio. Pocket change for a man worth $1.2 billion. I could write that check without thinking about it, solve all his problems with a signature. But I didn't get rich by making bad investments. And I sure as hell didn't get rich by rewarding people who'd betrayed me. I'll think about it, I said, setting down my glass and standing up. It's been a long day. Is there a hotel nearby where I can stay? You could stay here, Danny said quickly. We have a guest room. I think a hotel would be better. This has been a lot to process. I could see the panic starting to build in his eyes. He'd shown his hand too early, revealed how desperate he really was. Now he was wondering if he'd ruined his chance, if his rich father was going to disappear again and leave him to drown in Vincent's debts. Dad, he said as I headed toward the door. I'm sorry. For everything. For the things I said when I was a kid, for staying away so long, for only reaching out now when I need help. I was wrong. I stopped with my hand on the doorknob. 30 years I'd waited to hear those words. 30 years of dreaming about the moment my son would apologize, would acknowledge what he'd cost us both. But you know what? It didn't feel as good as I'd imagined it would. We'll talk tomorrow, I said. After I've had time to think. As I drove to the Marriott in town, I thought about the evening, about my grandchildren and their questions, about Danny's desperate confession, about the empire I'd built on the foundation of his betrayal. I thought about justice and revenge and the difference between the two. And I thought about the choice I was going to have to make, whether to save my son from the consequences of his choices, or let him drown in the mess that Vincent's success had really been all along. The answer was already forming in my mind. But Danny wasn't going to like it. I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. I lay in that hotel bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about Thomas and Emma and the way they looked at those watches, thinking about Jennifer's forced smile and Danny's desperate confession. Thinking about 30 years of silence, and what it had cost all of us. Around 3 in the morning, I got up and made some calls. Tokyo was already open for business, and I had people there who could run the numbers I needed. By dawn, I had a complete financial picture of Vincent's empire, and exactly how deep the hole really went. It was worse than Danny knew. Much worse. The sporting goods stores were hemorrhaging money, not just bleeding, but arterial bleeding that would kill the business within 6 months. Vincent had been robbing Peter to pay Paul for years, using creative accounting and shell games to hide the extent of the losses. The real debt wasn't $2 million. It was closer to $8 million. The house Danny thought was mortgaged. It wasn't just mortgaged, it was leveraged 3 times over, with Vincent using it as collateral for business loans that were now coming due. The life insurance policy Vincent had always promised would take care of everything? It had been cashed out 2 years ago to cover operating expenses. My son hadn't inherited a troubled business. He'd inherited a financial disaster that would destroy his family if someone didn't intervene soon. I called Danny at 7 a.m. and told him to meet me for breakfast. There was a diner downtown, the kind of place where working people ate before heading to jobs that actually produced something useful. I wanted him on neutral ground, somewhere that didn't smell like Vincent's money or echo with his children's voices. Danny arrived looking like he hadn't slept either. His hair was uncombed, his shirt wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of a man who'd spent the night staring at bills he couldn't pay and contemplating futures he couldn't face. "Dad," he said, sliding into the booth across from me. "Thank you for meeting me. I know yesterday was intense. Your financial situation is worse than you told me," I said without preamble. I spread the printouts across the table, balance sheets, loan documents, tax records that painted a picture of systematic financial suicide. "Much worse." Danny stared at the papers like they were written in a foreign language. Which, in a way, they were. Vincent had shielded him from the real numbers, kept him in the dark about just how badly the business was failing. $8 million, I continued. "That's what you really owe. Not counting the personal guarantees Vincent signed that make you liable for business debts. Not counting the tax liens that are about to be filed. Not counting the legal fees you're going to need when the creditors come calling." Danny's face went gray. $8 million? That can't be right. Vincent said the business was profitable. He said there were just some cash flow issues. Vincent was lying, I said bluntly. He'd been lying for years. Those stores haven't turned a real profit since 2018. He was using personal credit to prop up the business, using the business to secure personal loans, moving money around like a shell game. When he died, the music stopped and everyone wants to get paid. I watched my son process this information, watched him understand that his situation wasn't just bad, it was catastrophic. That he wasn't just looking at losing some money, he was looking at losing everything. The house, the cars, his children's stability, their entire way of life. "Can you help me?" he asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can," I said. "The question is whether I should." Danny looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "I mean that helping you would cost me about $10 million once I factor in legal fees and business cleanup costs. $10 million to save the son who spent 30 years pretending I didn't exist. I was a child when I made those choices," Danny said. "I was confused, angry about Mom's death, influenced by Vincent's lies." "You were 18 when you legally changed your name," I pointed out. "You were 23 when you got married and didn't invite me to the wedding. You were 35 when your children were born and you never told them they had a grandfather. At what age were you going to take responsibility for your choices?" Danny flinched like I'd hit him. I wanted to reach out. I thought about it, especially after the kids were born. But too much time had passed. I didn't know how to bridge that gap. "But you figured it out fast enough when Vincent died and left you broke." The words hung between us like a sword. I could see Danny struggling with them, trying to find an argument that would make his behavior seem less mercenary, less calculating. But we both knew the truth. If Vincent had lived another 10 years and left Danny a thriving business, this conversation would never be happening. What do you want from me? Danny asked. I want you to understand what your choices cost, I said. I want you to see what 30 years of silence looks like from the other side. I pulled out my phone and showed him a photo from my corporate website, me accepting an award from the Secretary of Defense for my work on embassy security. Then another photo, me shaking hands with a tech CEO whose safe room had probably saved his family's lives during a home invasion. Then another, me at a charity gala where I donated $5 million to children's hospitals. I built all of this, I said. While you were playing happy family with Vincent, I was creating something that matters. Something that protects people, saves lives, makes a difference. I employed 3,000 people who depend on me for their livelihoods. I've donated over $50 million to causes I believe in. I've become someone important, someone valuable, someone who contributes to the world. I'm proud of you, Danny said quietly. I really am. Are you? Or are you just impressed by the money? Danny was quiet for a long moment, stirring his coffee and avoiding my eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with something that might have been regret. Both, he admitted. I'm proud of what you accomplished, but I'm also desperate for your help. I know how that looks. I know it makes me seem like I only care about your money. But my kids, Dad, they don't deserve to lose everything because of mistakes I made 30 years ago. Your kids, I repeated. My grandchildren. The ones I've never been allowed to know because you were too busy playing perfect family with Vincent. I know I was wrong, Danny said. I know I hurt you. But please don't punish them for my mistakes. That's when I laid out my terms. I'll pay your debts, I said. All of them. I'll buy out the business partners, settle with the creditors, clear the liens on your house. I'll set up college funds for Thomas and Emma that will cover any school they want to attend. I'll even give you a job with my company, something that pays well enough to maintain your lifestyle. Danny's face lit up like Christmas morning. Dad, I don't know how to thank you. I'm not finished, I said. There are conditions. The light in his eyes dimmed slightly. What kind of conditions? First, you tell Thomas and Emma the truth about our relationship. All of it. Why we were separated, what role Vincent played, what choices you made. No more lies, no more convenient fiction about families just getting separated. They deserve to know who their grandfather really is and why they've never met me before. Danny shifted uncomfortably. They're just kids, Dad. Some of that history is pretty heavy. They're old enough to ask hard questions, they're old enough to hear honest answers. Second condition, you and your family spend the next year with me in Arizona. Not visiting, living. The kids go to school there, Jennifer finds work there, you learn my business from the ground up. You want my money? You're going to earn it by spending time with the family you abandoned. Move to Arizona? Danny looked panicked. But our whole life is here. Jennifer's job, the kids' friends, their schools. The kids' schools that Vincent paid for with money he didn't have? Jennifer's job at the dental office that pays $30,000 a year while you live in a house that costs $6,000 a month to maintain? That life? Danny was quiet, thinking through the implications. A year in Arizona meant a year away from everything familiar, a year of actually getting to know the father he'd rejected, a year of admitting to everyone who mattered that he needed to be rescued by the man he'd spent decades pretending was worthless. Third condition, I continued. You legally change your name back to Castellano. And Thomas and Emma take the Castellano name too. Vincent stole my son and tried to steal my bloodline. If you want my help, you restore what he took. The kids have never been anything but Morrison, Danny protested. It would be confusing for them. It would be honest for them. They're Castellanos whether their paperwork says so or not. DNA doesn't lie, even when families do. I let him sit with that for a moment before delivering the final condition. And one more thing. I want Vincent's grave moved to a public cemetery. No more private family plot, no more shrine to the man who destroyed our family. He gets a standard headstone in a standard cemetery like any other dead person. I can't do that, Danny said immediately. Sharon would never agree to it. Vincent's other relatives. Vincent's other relatives didn't inherit his debts, I pointed out. You did. You want my money to clean up his mess? Then his memory doesn't get honored like he was some kind of saint. He was a thief and a manipulator who died owing $8 million he'd stolen from other people. Let him be remembered accordingly. Danny stared at me across that diner table, finally understanding the true cost of my help. It wasn't just about money. It was about justice. About setting the record straight. About making sure that everyone who mattered understood who Frank Castellano really was and what Vincent Morrison had really done. You want me to give up everything, Danny said. My name, my home, my life here. I want you to give up the lie Vincent built for you, I corrected. I want you to live an honest life with your real family instead of a fake life built on stolen money and borrowed time. And if I say no, then you say no. I go back to Arizona, you go back to drowning in debt, and we probably never see each other again. Your choice. Danny closed his eyes and took a deep breath. I could almost see him weighing his options, calculating the cost of pride versus the cost of losing everything his children had ever known. When he opened his eyes, there was something different in them. Something that looked almost like respect. You've thought this through, he said. I've had 30 years to think it through. The whole year? We can't visit back and forth? The whole year. I miss 30 years of your life, Danny. I miss your graduation, your wedding, your children's births, their first steps, their first words. You owe me more than a few weekend visits. Danny was quiet for so long I thought he might get up and walk away. But finally he nodded. Okay, he said. All of it. The name changes, the move, the truth-telling. Everything. Just please don't make this any harder on Jennifer and the kids than it has to be. The truth is never easy, I said. But it's better than living a lie. As we shook hands across that diner table, sealing a deal that would reshape both our lives, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 30 years. I felt like a father again. But I also felt like a man who'd finally gotten his revenge. The hardest conversation of Danny's life happened that afternoon, in the living room where Vincent's pictures still smiled down from every wall. Jennifer sat on the couch between Thomas and Emma, holding their hands while Danny paced in front of the fireplace like a lawyer making his closing argument to a jury that held his life in their hands. I watched from the kitchen, officially making coffee but really observing the moment when my son finally told his family who their grandfather actually was. I need to tell you about your real grandfather, Danny began, his voice shaking slightly. About my father, and why we haven't talked for so long. We know about him, Thomas said. You said you had a disagreement. It was more than a disagreement, Danny said. It was. I made some bad choices when I was young. Choices that hurt him and hurt our family. Over the next hour, Danny laid it all out. Not everything, he was still protecting them from some of the uglier details, but enough truth to give them a real picture. He told them about Vincent taking over my business, about the poison Vincent had fed him, about me being a failure and a loser. He told them about choosing Vincent's money and status over his real father's love. He told them about legally changing his name and pretending I didn't exist. The children's reactions were everything I'd expected and nothing I'd prepared for. Thomas was angry. You lied to us, he said, his 13-year-old voice cracking with betrayal. All these years, you told us Grandpa Vince was Dad's father. You let us call him Grandpa when he wasn't even related to us. He was your great-uncle, Jennifer said gently. He did love you both very much. But he stole from our real grandfather, Emma said, and the simplicity of her child's logic cut through all the adult rationalizations like a knife. He stole Daddy's business and made Daddy think bad things about his real father. That's not love. That's mean. Jennifer looked stricken. This wasn't going the way she'd hoped. Sweetie, it's more complicated than that. No, it's not, Thomas said, and there was steel in his voice that reminded me powerfully of myself at that age. It's simple. Great-Uncle Vincent was a bad person who stole from our family. And Dad helped him by pretending his real father was dead. Danny winced like Thomas had slapped him. I was young, confused. You were 18 when you changed your name. Thomas shot back, and I realized he'd inherited more than my nose. He'd inherited my memory for details too. 18 isn't young. 18 is old enough to know better. Emma was crying now, but they weren't sad tears. They were angry tears, the kind children cry when they realize the adults they trusted have lied to them about something important. I want to meet our real grandfather, she announced. Not just meet him like yesterday, but really get to know him. He brought us expensive watches and he builds safe houses for movie stars and he's rich, and he's our real family. That's part of what we need to talk about, Danny said, glancing toward the kitchen where he knew I was listening. Your grandfather wants us to move to Arizona for a year. To live with him and really become a family. What about our house? Thomas asked. We might have to sell it, Jennifer said quietly. There are some financial problems. Because of Great-Uncle Vincent's lies, Emma said. It wasn't a question. This 10-year-old girl had put together the whole puzzle faster than most adults would have. Vincent had stolen from our family. Danny had chosen Vincent over me, and now they were broke because the man they trusted had been lying about everything. I want to go to Arizona, Thomas said suddenly. I want to know our real grandfather. And I want our real last name too. Thomas. Jennifer started. No, Mom. We've been living a lie. Our last name should be Castellano, not Morrison. Morrison isn't even our name, it was Great-Uncle Vincent's name. We're not Morrisons. We're Castellanos. Emma nodded vigorously. I want to be Emma Castellano. It sounds pretty. I had to step outside then, ostensibly to take a business call but really because I was afraid I might cry. These children, my grandchildren, were embracing their real identity with an enthusiasm their father had never shown. They wanted to be Castellanos. They wanted to know me. They wanted to claim their real heritage. Vincent had lost. After 30 years of poison and manipulation, he'd finally, definitively lost. When I came back inside, the family meeting was winding down. Thomas and Emma were excited about Arizona, asking questions about my house and my business, and whether there would be movie stars to meet. Jennifer looked shell-shocked but resigned, like someone who'd finally accepted that her comfortable life had been built on quicksand. Danny looked older than his 41 years. Telling the truth had aged him, forced him to confront 30 years of choices he'd been avoiding thinking about. But there was also something lighter in his expression, like he'd been carrying a weight he hadn't realized was there until he finally set it down. So we're really doing this? Jennifer asked me. Moving to Arizona, changing names, starting over? If you want my help with Vincent's debts, yes, I said. I know it's a big change. But Jennifer, you're a dental hygienist, right? I can get you a job with my company's medical staff, better pay, better benefits, more responsibility. Thomas, Emma, there are excellent schools in Scottsdale, and you'll both have college funds that will let you attend anywhere you want. What about friends? Thomas asked. I mean, I want to get to know you, but I have friends here. You can visit, I said. Summers, holidays, whenever you want. This isn't about cutting you off from your old life. It's about giving you a chance to build a new one. That evening, after Jennifer had put the kids to bed and we'd made tentative plans for the move, Danny and I sat on his back deck sharing a bottle of wine that probably cost more than his monthly grocery budget. The December air was cold, but there was something cleansing about it, like it was washing away years of accumulated lies and resentment. I keep waiting for this to feel wrong, Danny said. Moving across the country, changing our names, accepting your money. It should feel like giving up, like admitting defeat. But it doesn't? No. It feels like waking up from a dream that wasn't as good as I thought it was. He was quiet for a moment, staring up at stars that were barely visible through the suburban light pollution. Vincent always made it seem like you were the one who'd given up. Like you'd abandoned me and moved away and never looked back. I never moved away, I said. I moved to Phoenix, but I never stopped thinking about you. I hired private investigators 3 times just to see how you were doing. Danny looked at me sharply. You knew about my wedding? My kids? I knew about all of it. Your graduation, your job at Vincent's stores, Jennifer, Thomas, Emma. I've been watching from a distance for 30 years, waiting for some sign that you remembered you had a father. Why didn't you reach out? If you knew where I was, why didn't you call or write or? Because you'd made your choice. You'd chosen Vincent over me, chosen his name over mine, chosen his version of success over anything I could offer. What was I supposed to do? Show up uninvited and beg you to love me? Danny winced. I'm sorry. I'm so goddamn sorry, Dad. I was young and stupid and I believed lies about you because they were easier than facing the truth about what kind of man Vincent really was. What kind of man was Vincent really? Danny was quiet for so long I thought he wasn't going to answer. When he did, his voice was barely above a whisper. The kind of man who would steal his brother's business and then convince his nephew it was justified. The kind of man who would tell a grieving child that his father killed his mother through negligence. The kind of man who would spend 30 years building a lie and then die, leaving other people to deal with the consequences. And what kind of man am I? Danny looked at me then, really looked at me, maybe for the first time since I'd arrived. The kind of man who builds billion-dollar companies and still remembers which watch belonged to the man who built the Golden Gate Bridge. The kind of man who could have walked away from his broke son but chose to help him instead. The kind of man who spent 30 years getting rich enough to save his family, even after they'd abandoned him. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, two men who'd lost 3 decades to pride and misunderstanding, finally finding their way back to something that might eventually become love. There's one more thing, Danny said eventually. Something I never told Vincent, something I never told Jennifer or the kids. What? Every year on your birthday, I'd think about calling you. I'd look up your number, and yeah, I knew you were successful long before Forbes published that article, and I'd dial most of the digits. But I never finished the call. Why not? Because I was afraid you'd hang up on me. I was afraid you'd tell me it was too late, that too much time had passed, that I'd lost the right to call you Dad when I chose Vincent over you. I felt something crack in my chest, some wall I'd built around my heart 30 years ago when my son walked out of my life. It's never too late, I said. And you never lost the right to call me Dad. You just forgot you had it. Danny started crying then, not the careful, controlled tears of a man trying to maintain his dignity, but the raw, ugly sobs of someone who'd been carrying guilt and regret for most of his adult life. I put my arm around his shoulders, the first time I'd touched my son in 30 years, and felt him collapse against me like a child again. I miss you, he whispered. God, I miss you so much. But I was too proud to admit it, too scared to reach out, too convinced that you must hate me for what I'd done. I did hate you, I said honestly. For years I hated you. But I never stopped loving you. Even when I hated you, I loved you. We sat there on that deck until after midnight, father and son, talking through 30 years of silence and hurt and misunderstanding. Planning a future that would be built on truth instead of lies, on real family instead of borrowed affection, on love that had survived everything Vincent had done to destroy it. As I drove back to my hotel that night, I realized something had changed. The revenge I'd spent 3 decades planning didn't taste as sweet as I'd expected. Because revenge, it turns out, is a dish best served with a side of forgiveness. Otherwise, you're just eating poison and hoping your enemy dies. I'd gotten what I wanted. Vincent was dead and discredited. Danny was broken and dependent on me. My grandchildren wanted my name and my presence in their lives. I was rich beyond Vincent's wildest dreams, successful beyond his ability to diminish or dismiss. But what I really wanted, what I'd always really wanted, wasn't revenge at all. I wanted my family back. Moving a family across the country is complicated under the best circumstances. Moving a family that's fleeing financial disaster while changing their entire identity is something else entirely. Over the next 6 weeks, I learned things about Danny and Jennifer and my grandchildren that 30 years of private investigators and financial reports had never told me. I learned that Thomas had anxiety attacks when he was stressed, hyperventilating episodes that had started after Vincent's death when he'd sensed the adults around him were worried about something they wouldn't explain. I learned that Emma was dyslexic but brilliant, struggling with reading but capable of mathematical reasoning that impressed her teachers. I learned that Jennifer came from a working-class family in Buffalo and had always felt like an imposter in Vincent's wealthy world, never quite comfortable with the expensive lifestyle but terrified of losing it for her children's sake. Most importantly, I learned that my son had inherited my obsessive work ethic but none of my business sense. Danny worked 16-hour days at the sporting goods stores, throwing himself into manual labor and customer service with the desperate energy of a man trying to save a sinking ship by bailing water with a teacup. He'd never learned to read profit and loss statements, or understand cash flow or recognize the warning signs of financial collapse. Vincent had kept him deliberately ignorant, giving him the title of manager but none of the real knowledge he'd need to actually manage anything. The business was hemorrhaging money faster than I'd initially calculated. By the time we closed the stores and liquidated the inventory, the total debt was closer to $10 million. I wrote check after check, to suppliers, to landlords, to banks, to lawyers, to creditors who'd been waiting months for payment. The kind of money that would have destroyed most people, reduced to numbers on wire transfer forms that I signed without emotion. But the hardest part wasn't the money. It was watching Danny confront the full scope of Vincent's betrayal. We were in the main store on a Tuesday morning in February, boxing up inventory for the liquidation sale, when Danny found Vincent's private office files hidden behind a false wall. Financial records that Vincent had kept separate from everything else, documents that revealed the true depth of his deception. Vincent hadn't just stolen my business and lied about the sporting goods store's profitability. He'd been skimming money from the stores for years, siphoning cash into personal accounts that he'd used to fund his lifestyle. The house he'd bought for Danny, the cars, the vacations, the private school tuitions, all of it had been paid for with money stolen from his own business. Worse, Vincent had been planning to blame Danny for the losses. There were emails to lawyers discussing how to structure the business debt so that Danny would be personally liable for millions in loans he'd never signed for. Vincent had intended to use my son as a scapegoat, letting him take the blame for 30 years of financial mismanagement, while Vincent retired comfortably on the money he'd hidden away. He was going to destroy me, Danny said, staring at a printout of bank transfers that showed Vincent moving money into accounts Danny didn't even know existed. Even at the end, even after 30 years of treating me like his own son, he was planning to let me take the fall for his crimes. He was a sociopath, I said. Sociopaths don't love anyone. They just use people until those people stop being useful. Danny laughed bitterly. I defended him. When Jennifer would say he was controlling, when Thomas would ask why he never let me make real decisions about the business, I'd defend him. I'd say he was just trying to protect me, that he knew better than I did about business matters. He groomed you, I pointed out. For 30 years, he groomed you to be dependent on him, to never question his decisions, to believe you weren't smart enough or capable enough to understand how things really worked. Just like he groomed me to believe you were worthless. We worked in silence for a while, boxing up 30 years of Vincent's lies. Trophies from golf tournaments he'd won with money stolen from his own business. Photos of family vacations paid for with cash that should have gone to suppliers. A framed copy of a newspaper article about his successful business expansion that had actually been funded by loans he never intended to repay. Dad, Danny said as we loaded the last box into the truck, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. Okay. When you offered to help me, when you laid out those conditions about moving to Arizona and changing our names, was that about getting revenge on Vincent? Or was it about getting your family back? I thought about lying, about giving him the answer that would make him feel better about accepting my help. But we'd had enough lies in this family to last several lifetimes. Both, I said. I wanted to prove Vincent wrong about me, and I wanted to erase what he'd stolen from our family. But I also wanted to know my grandchildren and have a relationship with my son. The revenge was real, but so was everything else. Danny nodded slowly. I can live with that. I think maybe I needed someone to be angry about what Vincent did to us. I was so grateful to him for taking care of me that I never let myself be angry about what he'd taken away. The move to Arizona happened in March. Thomas and Emma adapted faster than anyone expected, throwing themselves into new schools and new friends with the resilience of children who'd been through enough adult drama to appreciate genuine stability. Jennifer took to her new job with an enthusiasm that surprised everyone, including herself. Turns out she'd been wasted as a dental hygienist in Albany. She had natural management skills and a talent for organization that made her invaluable to my company's medical division. Danny was a different story. My son had spent 30 years believing he wasn't smart enough for real responsibility, and unlearning that kind of programming takes time. I started him in my company's training program, the same program every new executive went through, but he struggled with confidence in ways that broke my heart. I don't understand this financial analysis, he'd say, staring at spreadsheets that any MBA student could interpret. Vincent always said I wasn't good with numbers. Vincent said a lot of things that weren't true, I'd reply. Work through it step by step. You're smarter than you think you are. It took months, but gradually Danny began to see himself the way I saw him, as a man who'd been deliberately kept ignorant, but who had the intelligence and work ethic to learn anything he set his mind to. He started asking better questions, challenging assumptions, proposing solutions to problems that impressed my other executives. By summer, he was running point on a major contract renovation for a tech company's headquarters. By fall, he was leading client meetings and presenting proposals that won us millions in new business. But the real transformation happened with Thomas and Emma. My grandchildren bloomed in Arizona like desert flowers after rain. Thomas discovered that his anxiety disappeared when he was engaged in meaningful work, and he started spending afternoons in my company's workshop, learning about security systems and electronic locks with the same intensity I'd once brought to carpentry. Emma's dyslexia became irrelevant when she found math and science, subjects where her visual spatial intelligence gave her advantages over children who relied on traditional reading skills. They both legally changed their names to Castellano in June, in a courthouse ceremony that felt more meaningful than any wedding or graduation I'd ever attended. Thomas Anthony Castellano and Emma Rose Castellano, carrying forward a name that Vincent had tried to erase from existence. The first time Emma introduced herself as Emma Castellano to a new classmate, I had to excuse myself and go cry in a bathroom stall like a teenager. 68 years old, worth over $1 billion, and completely undone by a 10-year-old girl claiming her real heritage. But if you think this story ends with everyone living happily ever after, you don't know much about real families. Because the hardest conversation was still coming, and it would happen on a December evening exactly 1 year after Danny's first letter arrived. We were sitting on the patio of my house in Scottsdale, a house that was now our house, where Thomas had his own workshop and Emma had converted a spare bedroom into a math laboratory that looked like something from a science fiction movie. Jennifer was inside helping Emma with a science project, and Thomas was at basketball practice with the team he'd made as a starting guard despite being the new kid. Danny and I were sharing a beer and watching the sunset paint the desert mountains in shades of gold and red when he asked the question I'd been dreading for months. "What happens when the year is up?" he said. "Do we stay here, or do we go back to New York? What do you want to do?" "I want to stay," Danny said immediately. "The kids love it here, Jennifer loves her job, I'm learning more about business in 6 months with you than I learned in 20 years with Vincent. But I need to know that you want us here because we're family, not because you're still trying to prove something about Vincent." I looked at my son, really looked at him. The boy who'd once told me he wished Vincent was his real father was gone, replaced by a man who learned to think for himself, to question authority, to build something meaningful with his own hands and mind. The man sitting next to me bore my name and my face, but more importantly, he carried my values and my work ethic and my stubborn refusal to give up when things got difficult. "Vincent's dead," I said. "I proved everything I needed to prove when Forbes published that article, and when you came asking for my help. The revenge is over. What happens now isn't about Vincent anymore. It's about us. So you want us to stay? I want you to stay, I said. Not because I'm trying to win some contest with a dead man, but because I've spent 30 years building a business empire, and I don't have anyone to leave it to except family. And you're my family? You and Jennifer and Thomas and Emma. You're my legacy. Danny was quiet for a long moment, processing this. Then he smiled, the first completely unguarded smile I'd seen from him since he was 8 years old. Then we'll stay, he said. We'll stay and build something together. Something better than what Vincent built, something honest and lasting and good. That night, I called my lawyers and started the process of restructuring my will and my business succession plans. Castellano Security Solutions would belong to the Castellano family, all of us. Danny would inherit the majority, but Thomas and Emma would have stakes too, insurance policies that would guarantee they'd never have to depend on anyone else's version of success. But more than that, I was finally building what I'd really wanted all along, not just a business empire, but a family legacy that would outlast all of us. Vincent had stolen 30 years from me. But I'd gotten something better in return. I'd gotten 30 years of motivation to become the man my family deserved, the father and grandfather who could protect them and provide for them and teach them to protect and provide for themselves. And I'd learned something that all the money in the world couldn't buy: forgiveness doesn't make you weak. It makes you strong enough to build something better than revenge. 5 years have passed since that Christmas when Danny's letter arrived and changed everything. As I'm recording this story for you, sitting in the same office where I built an empire on the foundation of my anger, I can see my grandson Thomas through the window. He's 21 now, a senior at MIT studying cybersecurity, but he's home for winter break and working in our company's new research facility. In 2 years, he'll graduate and join the business full-time. He's already designed security systems that are more sophisticated than anything I could have imagined when I was his age. Emma is 16. A mathematical prodigy who's been accepted to Stanford's early admission program. She could start college next fall, but she's chosen to finish high school first, not because she isn't ready for the academic challenge, but because she wants to spend more time in our workshop, learning the hands-on skills that complement her theoretical knowledge. She's working on a biometric security system for her senior project that has already attracted interest from Fortune 500 companies. Danny is 46 now, and he's become the kind of business leader I always knew he could be. Sharp, decisive, ethical, with an intuitive understanding of how to build something that lasts. He's taken over day-to-day operations of most of the company, freeing me to focus on the kinds of long-term strategic planning that I enjoy. More importantly, he's become the kind of father I always wanted to be: present, engaged, supportive without being controlling. Jennifer runs our entire medical and human resources division now, overseeing the health and welfare of nearly 4,000 employees across 3 countries. She's also going to law school at night, planning to handle our legal affairs in-house rather than relying on outside firms. She says she wants to understand every aspect of the business that provides for her family. But the most important change isn't in what we do, it's in who we are. We're a family. Not a perfect family. Not a family without scars, but a real family that chooses to be together rather than just happening to share the same blood. We have Sunday dinners together every week. We take vacations together, real vacations where we turn off our phones and focus on each other. We've started traditions that are ours, not borrowed from Vincent or anyone else. Thomas and Emma know stories about their great-grandparents, about the Castellano family history that goes back 4 generations. They understand where they come from and what that means. They also understand the cost of the choices their father made when he was young. Not because we punish him for those choices, but because honesty requires acknowledging that actions have consequences, even when those consequences take 30 years to fully unfold. But here's what I want you to understand, whoever you are listening to this story: this isn't really a story about revenge. It's a story about the difference between success and fulfillment. I spent 30 years building a billion-dollar empire, and I was successful by every measure that matters to most people. I had money, power, respect, influence. I could buy anything I wanted, go anywhere I wanted, do anything I wanted. But I wasn't fulfilled. I was hollow inside, going through the motions of a successful life while the only thing that really mattered, my family, remained missing. The revenge I got on Vincent was real and complete. He died never knowing that his worthless brother had become richer and more successful than he could have imagined. He died believing he'd won, but his victory was built on lies that crumbled the moment he was no longer around to maintain them. But revenge, I learned, is ultimately empty. It doesn't fill the spaces in your heart that loss and betrayal have carved out. It doesn't give you someone to share your success with. It doesn't create meaning or purpose or joy. What creates those things is love. Specifically, love that's chosen rather than demanded, earned rather than assumed, built rather than inherited. 3 months ago, I was diagnosed with early-stage pancreatic cancer. The same disease that took my wife Carol all those years ago. The doctors caught it early, and the treatment is going well, but it forced me to confront my own mortality in ways I hadn't had to before. My first thought wasn't about my business, or my money, or my legacy in the traditional sense. My first thought was about making sure Thomas and Emma and Danny and Jennifer would be okay without me. Not financially, I'd already taken care of that. But emotionally, practically, as a family unit that could function and thrive even after the patriarch was gone. That's when I realized I'd finally succeeded at the thing that mattered most. I'd built not just a business empire, but a family dynasty. Thomas and Emma would carry the Castellano name forward with pride. Danny would continue building on what we'd started together. Jennifer would make sure they all stayed connected to their values and their history. And someday, when they're old and gray and telling their own grandchildren about their lives, they won't remember me primarily as the grandfather who was rich. They'll remember me as the grandfather who came back, who chose love over revenge, who taught them that family isn't just about blood, it's about commitment and choice and the daily decision to show up for each other. Vincent Morrison is buried in a modest grave in a public cemetery, his headstone noting only his name and dates of birth and death. No flowery epitaph about being a beloved father or successful businessman. Just the basic facts of a life that was built on other people's money and other people's dreams. I visit his grave sometimes, not out of respect but out of a strange kind of gratitude. Because Vincent, in his way, gave me the greatest gift of my life. He gave me 30 years of motivation to become worthy of my family's love. He forced me to build something so undeniably successful that even his poison couldn't diminish it. He made me strong enough to save my son and grandchildren when they needed saving. Most of all, he taught me the difference between taking something and earning it, between demanding loyalty and inspiring it, between owning something and deserving it. My cancer treatment will be finished by spring. The doctors are optimistic, and so am I. I have too much left to do, too many grandchildren's graduations to attend, too many Sunday dinners to host, too many family traditions to establish and maintain. But even if the cancer comes back, even if I don't get as many years with my family as I'd like, I'm at peace in a way I never was during those 30 years of separation. Because I know now that success isn't about how much money you make, or how many people know your name, or how big an empire you build. Success is about whether the people you love choose to love you back. Whether your children want you in their lives not because they need your money, but because they enjoy your company. Whether your grandchildren carry your name with pride rather than shame. Whether you've built something that makes the world a little bit safer, a little bit better, a little bit more honest. And if you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted, if you've ever lost someone you loved to pride and misunderstanding, if you've ever wondered whether it's possible to rebuild what seemed permanently broken, then let me tell you this, it is possible. It's hard, it takes time, it requires more forgiveness than seems humanly possible. But it is possible. You just have to decide what you really want. Revenge? Or redemption? Because in the end, you can have both. And only one of them will give you the life you actually want to live. My name is Frank Castellano. I'm 73 years old, worth $1.7 billion, and the father of a son who calls me every day not because he needs anything, but because he wants to share his life with me. And that, more than all the money in the world, is what success really looks like. If this story moved you, if it made you think about your own family relationships, or if it reminded you that it's never too late to choose love over anger, then please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because the best stories aren't just entertainment. They're invitations to live better lives. And if you're estranged from someone you love, if pride or hurt or time has built walls between you and your family, maybe it's time to write your own letter. Maybe it's time to choose connection over being right, relationship over revenge, love over everything that tries to stand in its way. Because 30 years is a long time to wait for a second chance. But it's never too long if both sides are willing to do the work. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring about an old man's story of loss and love and the long road back to what matters most. Now go call your family.